The HFY fleet crossed into monitored human space on a Tuesday morning by Earth's calendar. Nobody on the HFY side thought the day of the week mattered. Nobody on the HFY side thought much of anything about how humans measured time. Why would they? Time, like most things belonging to the humans, seemed small and fragile from the outside. The fleet's commander was a HFY officer named Vorath Sen. He had commanded campaigns for 31 years and had a chest full of decorations that he never wore outside formal council events, because he considered public displays of pride to be a form of insecurity. He was precise, disciplined, and completely confident. He had studied the intelligence reports on humanity for exactly 2 hours before concluding that the campaign would take no more than 3 weeks. Vorath Sen's first order upon crossing the border was simple: scan everything, record everything, and prepare to begin systematic destruction of human military infrastructure. His long-range sensors swept the area in every direction. The results came back almost immediately. There was nothing there. Not nothing significant. Not nothing dangerous. Just nothing. The border colonies were empty. The defense stations were powered down. The communication relays were active, but transmitting only automated maintenance signals, the kind of low-level broadcasts that ran on timers and meant no one was home. Vorath Sen stood at his command post and stared at the readings for a long moment. The results were exactly the same. He recorded a short message for the council. The humans appeared to have fled. He and his fleet would advance and begin destroying their infrastructure. He was not worried. Running was what weak species did. He had seen it before. What Vorath Sen did not know, what his sensors could not tell him, was that the humans had not run. They had simply moved. And there was a very important difference between the two. 9 days before the HFY fleet crossed the border, Paige Holloway had begun the largest quiet evacuation in human history. Paige worked from a small office on Heron Station, with 2 assistants, a mapping screen, and a list of cargo freighter captains she had built relationships with over 12 years of running border colony logistics. She did not use emergency channels. She did not file government evacuation forms. She simply called people she trusted and told them there was cargo that needed moving. Quietly, on short timelines, to specific coordinates deeper in human space. The captains asked very few questions. Most of them had been operating on the edge of human territory long enough to know that when a trusted administrator called at odd hours and used the word quietly, you asked for the coordinates and you went. In 9 days, Paige moved 2,060,000 people off 3 border worlds. She did it in small groups, spread across dozens of ships, using old mining routes and agricultural transport lanes that barely appeared in standard navigation databases. When the HFY sensors swept those worlds, they found empty buildings, cold landing pads, and lights running on timers. She sent Owen Garrett a single short message: done. Owen read it, set his communication device on the desk, and moved on to the next problem. At Site Keller, a deep space installation that appeared in no public record and whose coordinates existed only in a small number of encrypted files, Derek Cole had arrived with a team of 11 people. They were not a military unit in any formal sense. There were no uniforms, no rank badges, no official insignia anywhere on the walls. The installation itself looked like a converted cargo depot from the outside, and the inside was not much more impressive. Gray walls, functional lighting, and equipment bolted to surfaces that had clearly been modified many times over the years. It had the feel of a place that had been useful for a long time, without ever being comfortable. Derek's team was a collection of people with specific skills and very short public records. Aaron Briggs had spent 18 years as a naval demolitions expert, before his file was reclassified and he simply ceased to exist in any accessible database. He was quiet and methodical, and he could calculate a blast radius in his head faster than most people could find a calculator. He arrived at Site Keller with one bag, and immediately began reviewing the facility's equipment inventory without being asked. Laura Voss had spent 4 years as an intelligence analyst studying Vreth military engagement records. Every campaign they had ever fought, every species they had ever faced, every tactical decision their commanders had made. She had filled 6 physical notebooks with careful observations and had found a pattern in the data that she had never formally reported through official channels, because she had not trusted that the people receiving those reports would understand what she was seeing. She had kept it instead, patient and certain, waiting for the right context to use it. When Derek called her, she packed her notebooks without hesitation. The pattern Laura had found was simple in the way that important things often are. The Vreth always attacked what they could see. Every campaign in their history had been fought against enemies who announced themselves, who showed their fleets, broadcast their positions, and responded to provocation in visible ways. The Dominion had never, in 200 years of conquest, fought an enemy that went completely silent and waited. She believed that silence, used correctly, was a weapon the Vreth had no training to face. Claire Novak finished the Fold Strike drive array on the 13th day. She finished it at 2 in the morning, which she only knew because the diagnostic screen finally stopped displaying errors and showed a single, clean green status line. She sat in front of it for a few minutes, just looking at it. Then she went and woke up her lead technician, a careful and methodical man named Gary Sutton, and told him to begin the installation sequence. Gary looked at the clock on the wall. He looked at Claire. Then he went and got his tools without saying anything. The Fold Strike system did not move a ship through space in any conventional sense. It placed a ship somewhere else in a single instant, with no transit signature, no detectable approach vector, and no warning of any kind. Claire had spent 3 years making sure the energy output during the fold was completely masked, meaning that from the outside, from any sensor array currently known to exist, the ship was simply not there, and then it was. She had tested it 17 times on unmanned drones. All 17 had worked. Owen Garrett received her status report the following morning. He read it over coffee, set the mug down carefully, and authorized deployment with a short typed confirmation. 36 hours later, the ReturnedHFY fleet was deep in what had been human border space. Vorax Sen was still finding nothing. No resistance, no defensive formations, no communication traffic from any military source. The advance was going exactly as planned, but there was no one to fight. And somewhere beneath the confidence, in a part of his mind that he had trained very hard to keep quiet, that fact had begun to feel wrong in a way he could not name. In the dark ahead of the ReturnedHFY formation, in a section of space that every sensor in the fleet had scanned and logged as empty, 4 human vessels running Fold Strike arrays sat completely still and waited. They had been in position for 6 hours. Their crews worked quietly and without hurry. They were patient people, all of them. It was, in many ways, the most important thing about them. The first sign that something had gone wrong was not an explosion. It was not a distress call, or a battle report, or a spike in any communication network. The first sign was simply that Vorax Sen stopped sending updates. For a fleet commander on an active campaign, regular updates were standard procedure. Vorax Sen had been sending them every 12 hours, brief, factual, unremarkable messages about fleet position and the continuing absence of human resistance. Then, at the 48-hour mark, the updates stopped. The Vreth War Council noticed after 24 hours of silence. They ran diagnostics on the relay stations. The equipment was functioning normally. The signal pads were clear and open. The silence was not a technical problem. It was just silence, deep and wide and without explanation. Zareth Vaughn sat at the head of the council table and looked at the star chart floating in the air above it. The position where the ReturnedHFY fleet had last reported was marked with a small blue indicator light. The indicator had not moved in 32 hours. He tapped it once, with one finger. It blinked back at him, steady and unhelpful. "Send a signal to Vorath Sen," he said. "Direct channel, highest priority." The signal was sent. No response came. The council chamber, which was usually filled with the sound of careful planning and the quiet confidence of people who were used to winning, became very still. On the other side of the galaxy, in the operations bay of Site Keller, Aaron Briggs was writing a post-action report. He wrote it the same way he wrote all his reports, in plain, factual language, with no unnecessary detail and no emotional content. He noted times, positions, actions taken, and outcomes. He wrote it by hand in a plain black notebook, because he had always preferred that to typing, and because handwritten notes could be destroyed quickly if the situation ever required it. He had developed that habit a long time ago, and saw no reason to change it. He finished the report, closed the notebook and set it on the table, beside two others that were already full. Derek Cole came into the bay while Aaron was making tea, and asked if everything was properly documented. Aaron said yes, without looking up. Derek nodded and went back to the main room. Laura Voss was at her workstation, reviewing data on a flat-screen tablet. Her 6 notebooks were open beside her, arranged in a precise row. She was moving through them slowly, cross-referencing entries, circling things with a red stylus. Her face showed no particular emotion. She had the expression of someone doing careful work that she found satisfying in a quiet, private way. What the data confirmed was exactly what she had predicted. The ReturnedHFY had moved in a standard search and engage formation, sweeping for visible threats and expecting to find a conventional enemy that would show itself. When nothing appeared, they had continued advancing, rather than stopping to reassess. That was the Vreth pattern. She had seen it in their records from campaign after campaign. An absence of visible resistance was always interpreted as a retreat, never as preparation. 200 years of successful conquest had made that assumption invisible to them. They had stopped being able to see it as an assumption at all. Laura made a small note in the margin of the last notebook. She would write a full analysis report later, when there was time. Far from Site Keller, in the operations center of a human vessel that had no name on its hull, and no registration in any public naval database, Owen Garrett was standing at a wide observation window. Outside the window, a debris field drifted slowly through space. The debris was Vreth in origin: hull panels, propulsion housings, sections of structural framing. It moved without hurry, the way things moved when there was no longer anyone to care about where they were going. Owen stood at the window and watched it for a while. Behind him, 2 crew members worked quietly at their stations and did not speak. His communication screen lit up. He walked across the room and read the message from Derek. It said, "Site Keller confirms 47. Recon wave confirms 8. Awaiting next contact." He picked up a pen from the desk, wrote a short number on a piece of paper, folded the paper, and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he went back to the window and stood there a little longer. Back in the Vreth Dominion, Zareth Vaughn made a decision. He sent a second wave, 8 ships, not a battle group, but a reconnaissance force. He was careful about it. He did not want to move another large fleet into a situation he did not yet understand. The 8 vessels were fast and lightly armed, crewed by experienced officers with specific training in intelligence gathering. Their job was simple: go in, find out what happened to the ReturnedHFY, and come back with information. They entered the border zone, moved to the coordinates of the ReturnedHFY fleet's last reported position, and transmitted a standard arrival ping. The ping was received by the relay network. It was logged and time-stamped, and then the 8 ships went silent, exactly like the fleet before them. The council chamber did not erupt when the second silence settled in. It did not fill with noise and argument the way it usually did when things went wrong. The members simply sat with the information for a moment, and the moment stretched longer than it should have. Selthmar, the oldest member of the council, a thin man who had served in Vreth military service for 50 years, set his hands flat on the table, and said quietly what several others were already thinking, but had not said. "We don't know what is in there," he said. Nobody argued with him. Zareth Vaughn walked to the observation window on the side of the chamber, the one that faced in the direction of human space. It was too far to see anything. It was always too far to see anything from here. But he stood there for a moment anyway, looking out at the dark, the way a person looks at a problem they have not yet found the edge of. In 200 years, the Dominion had never lost a full battle fleet without a single distress call. Not once. Every campaign, even the difficult ones against species that had fought hard and with real skill, had produced something. Wreckage to examine, survivors to question, signals to analyze, something to work with, something to understand. The border zone was producing nothing at all. Zareth Vaughn turned from the window and called an emergency session. He did not tell the council he was concerned, because Vreth executors did not use that word. But his voice was flatter than usual, and the council members were experienced enough to know the difference. In a cold research station near Jupiter, Claire Novak was running a routine post-deployment diagnostic on the Fold Strike arrays. The numbers were clean across every system. She made a small notation in her log, finished the last of a cold cup of coffee without noticing it was cold, and began setting up the system for a potential second deployment window. Gary Sutton was working at the station across from her. After a while, he asked, without looking up from his screen, whether she thought it was over. Claire thought about the question for a moment. "The first part," she said. Gary nodded slowly and kept working. At Heron Station, Paige Holloway was sitting at her desk, going through the paperwork that had built up while she was focused on the evacuation. Most of it was routine: cargo manifests, maintenance requests, colony support budget reviews. She worked through it one item at a time, in order, the way she always worked. On the wall beside her desk, she had a small printed photograph of the border colony she had spent the most time evacuating. The buildings in the photograph were plain and functional, the kind of structures people built when they were thinking about lasting rather than impressing. She looked at the photo for a moment, then went back to her work. The colony was empty now, but it was still standing. She had been very careful about that, getting people out while leaving everything else intact and untouched. Owen had told her it mattered, and she had trusted that he knew why, and she had made sure every single team she sent understood the same thing. She filed the last document of the evening, turned off the desk lamp, and sat in the quiet for a minute before getting up to go home. In the war chamber of the Vreth Dominion, Zareth Vaughn looked at his council across the wide table. "We need to know what happened to our people," he said. No one disagreed. The question, heavy and uncomfortable in a room full of people who were not used to feeling either, was what to do next. The Vreth Council spent 3 days debating before they agreed on what to do next. It was a longer debate than any of them wanted to admit they were having. The problem was not purely tactical. It was something harder to name than tactics. The council was made up of people who had spent their entire careers standing on the certainty of Vreth superiority. And the silence coming back from the border zone was doing something to that certainty. Something slow and structural, like water finding the cracks in stone. Eventually, Zareth Vaughn ended the debate the way he ended most debates. He made a decision and told everyone else to stop talking. They would send a single scout vessel, one ship stripped of most of its weapons to make room for an extended sensor array. A mission was straightforward: enter the border zone, travel to the last known coordinates of the Rethkai fleet, scan everything, record everything, and return. No engagement, no contact. Just information. The pilot selected for the mission was a young Vreth officer named Sen Kar. He was 26 years old and had been flying scout missions for 4 years. He was not selected because he was the finest pilot available. He was selected because he was junior enough that losing him would not significantly affect the Council's operational planning. Sen Kar was not told this, and no one in the Council chamber felt any particular need to mention it. He prepared his vessel with the careful, methodical attention that he brought to every mission. He ran full equipment checks twice, logged every system in detail, and loaded 3 times the standard amount of emergency rations, because he was the kind of person who prepared for things going wrong. He had been told only that communication with the HFY fleet had been lost, and that visual confirmation of the fleet's status was needed. He entered the border zone at low speed, with his sensor array running at full range and his engines at quiet running power to minimize his own signature. The first thing his instruments showed him was the debris. It was spread across a wide area of space, but not in the way that battle debris normally spread. In a standard engagement, wreckage scattered outward from the point of impact in irregular directions, driven by explosions and momentum, and the chaotic physics of ships that had been hit suddenly and hard. That was what battle debris looked like. Sen Kar had seen it before, at the sites of old Vreth campaigns. It was always messy. It was always recognizable. This was different. The larger hull fragments were grouped in clusters, and each cluster corresponded roughly to the final position of a single Vreth vessel. The spacing between clusters was consistent. The damage patterns were consistent. The wreckage had the quality of something that had been handled rather than destroyed, precise and organized in a way that felt deeply wrong to him, though he could not immediately explain why. He reduced speed further and began moving slowly through the outer edge of the field, scanning and recording everything without stopping. After 2 hours of careful searching, he found the black box recorder of one of the main HFY vessels. It was intact, a small, reinforced unit built to survive almost any level of damage, drifting in a slow arc about 100 meters from the main wreckage cluster of its ship. He pulled it in and ran the data through his analysis system. The final sensor logs of the HFY vessel told a story that lasted 3 seconds. For most of the mission record, the logs were completely normal. Standard navigation entries, communication records, routine sensor sweeps showing empty space in every direction. And then, in the final 3 seconds of the recording, a single entry appeared. A massive kinetic impact arriving from a direction that the ship's own sensors had logged as empty. No approach vector detected, no drive signature, no warning of any kind. The ship's defensive systems had activated automatically on impact. The weapons had armed. Then the power had cut out across every system simultaneously. 3 seconds of awareness, 3 seconds of response, 3 seconds, and then nothing. They had tried to do their jobs. They had simply not had enough time. Sen Kar sat with the data on his screen for a long while and did not move. He was not a coward. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. He had flown into genuinely dangerous situations before. He had been fired on, pursued, and caught in the edge radius of weapons not meant for his ship. He had kept his hands steady through all of it and done what was required of him. But he was also honest, which was perhaps more useful than courage in certain moments. And what he was honest with himself about now was this. The HFY were the finest combat force the Dominion had produced. They had never been beaten. They had never even been seriously tested by any enemy the Dominion had encountered in 200 years of expansion. And they had been taken apart so completely and so quickly that not one crew member from 47 ships had managed to send a single distress call. He began preparing to leave. He had what he came for. He would bring the data back to the Council and let them decide what it meant. Then his long-range scanner registered a contact. He almost did not check it. His hand was already moving toward the drive controls, but the scanner showed an object at the outer edge of its maximum range, and the shape and mass reading were consistent with a vessel. And Sen-Kar was the kind of pilot who always checked things before leaving. He looked. It was a human ship. It was sitting completely still at the edge of his sensor range, not moving, not maneuvering, not broadcasting anything on any frequency. It was positioned exactly far enough away to make any kind of engagement impossible, as if someone had calculated the exact distance and parked there deliberately. Its engines showed a low idle signature, the kind of minimal power output a ship produced when it was not going anywhere and had no immediate plans to. No weapons were deployed. No communications were active. It was simply there, in the dark, watching him. Sen-Kar stared at it on his screen for a full minute without moving. The ship did not approach. It did not signal. It did not change its position by a single degree. It sat there the way something sits when it has all the time available to it and no particular reason to hurry. It was not threatening him. It was not acting aggressively or making any kind of move that he could classify as hostile. It was not doing anything he could respond to or file a tactical assessment about. It was just present, patient, utterly still. Sen-Kar had faced genuine threats before and kept himself together. He was proud of that. But this was something different, and he did not have a category for it. The ship was not trying to scare him. It wasn't trying to do anything at all. It simply existed in that spot in the dark, and looked at him across the distance. And the fact that it was doing nothing was somehow the most frightening thing he had ever encountered in his career. He activated his faster-than-light drive and left. He filed his full report to the Council from deep in Vreth-controlled space, with his hands slightly unsteady, in a way he was absolutely not going to mention in any official document. He attached the black box data, his complete sensor recordings, and the coordinates and profile of the human vessel he had observed. He submitted everything without any personal commentary, because the personal commentary he wanted to write was not the kind of thing that belonged in a report to the High Executor. At Site Keller, Laura Voss was watching the scout ship's departure signature on her display screen. She watched the trail until it faded entirely, then leaned back in her chair and told Derek Cole what she had observed. Derek looked at the display for a moment, his expression unchanged. "They'll talk," he said simply. Laura agreed. She picked up her stylus and made one final note in the last of her 6 notebooks. Outside, somewhere in the space between two civilizations, the human vessel that had been watching the scout turned slowly and moved away from the debris field. It left no trail behind it. It made no transmission. It went quietly, without hurry, back into the dark where it had come from. Back toward the silence it had helped to build. Zareth Vaughn received Sen-Kar's report at the start of the 5th day of silence, and read it alone, standing at his desk, before anyone else in the council had arrived for the morning session. He read it quickly the first time. Then he sat down and read it again, slowly. The data was clear. The Rethkai fleet had been destroyed, not in a drawn-out battle, not after a long and costly engagement, but quickly, completely, and with a precision that the black box logs could barely begin to describe. Impacts from directions logged as empty space. No approach, no warning, no signature. The reconnaissance wave had been handled the same way, and the scout pilot had observed a single human vessel, sitting motionless at the edge of sensor range, doing nothing, watching, waiting. Zareth Vaughn set the report on his desk. He sat still for a moment. Then he looked at the map on the far wall, a large, carefully detailed map of the Dominion's full territory, showing 43 conquered systems and the projected expansion routes for the next 50 years. He had looked at that map almost every morning of his career. It had always looked like a plan moving steadily forward. This morning, it looked like a set of assumptions that no one had ever thought to test. The council session was quiet, in a way that council sessions rarely were. Zareth Vaughn presented the report without commentary and let the members read it themselves. Selthmar finished first and set the document down with the slow, deliberate movements of someone making sure they did not show a reaction they did not intend to show. Some of the younger members read it twice. Nobody spoke for almost a full minute. Then one of the younger council members asked what they were going to do next. He had decided it somewhere between the first reading and the second, in the quiet of an office where no one was watching him think. "We are going to communicate with them," he said. The objections were quieter than they would have been a week ago. One member noted that reaching out was an admission of a weakness they could not afford. Zareth Vaughn did not disagree, but he said that reaching out was preferable to sending more ships into a situation they did not understand. Another member said they did not even know who to contact on the human side. Zareth Vaughn said they would find out. The session ended 20 minutes later, and his communication staff had their instructions. Finding the right human contact took 6 hours. The Dominion had accumulated a significant amount of human communication data over the years. Intercepted signals, translated public broadcasts, traffic analysis from dozens of monitoring systems placed near the border. Working carefully through all of it, Zareth Vaughn's staff traced the operational chain connected to the vessel that Senkar had observed. It was slow, methodical work, but it eventually led them to a name: Owen Garrett. The communication request was sent on a standard diplomatic frequency. It was formatted carefully, without demands, and without the tone of a superior addressing an inferior. It was the most measured and deliberately worded message that Zareth Vaughn's communication staff had ever been asked to draft. They rewrote it twice before sending. Owen Garrett accepted the call 8 minutes later. He appeared on the screen in a plain gray thermal shirt, seated at a simple metal desk. There was a coffee mug on the desk beside him. He had not put on a uniform or changed his clothing or done anything to make himself look more formal than he did on any ordinary morning. He looked at the screen with a calm, attentive expression, the expression of someone who was listening and had not yet heard anything that required a reaction. Behind him, slightly off to one side and partially out of frame, Paige Holloway stood, holding a tablet and watching without speaking. Zareth Vaughn was flanked by his full council, all 14 members. He had worn his formal presentation robes. The council members seated behind him were in full ceremonial uniform. It was the kind of display the Dominion used when it wanted to communicate authority, history, and weight. Owen was in a thermal shirt. Zareth Vaughn introduced himself, gave his full title, briefly acknowledged the military events that had brought them to this point, and then asked his question directly. He said, "What are you?" Owen picked up the coffee mug, held it for a moment, and then set it back down. He looked at the screen with the same unhurried expression he had worn since the call connected. He said he was going to answer honestly, and they should understand that what he was about to describe was not meant as a threat and not meant as a boast. It was simply the truth as he understood it. He told them that humanity had been at war with itself for the entirety of its recorded history. Not occasionally, continuously. Every generation had fought another. Neighboring peoples, rival nations, opposing beliefs, competing ideas about how the world should be organized. Every weapon humanity had ever built was developed first and most extensively to be used against other humans. The fold strike technology that had been deployed against the ReturnedHFY fleet was based on research that had been running inside classified military programs for decades. Not in anticipation of alien contact, but because human military planners were always looking for an advantage over other humans. That was simply how the work had always been done. He told them that the unit operating out of Site Keller was not a special program assembled in response to the Vreth Dominion. It was a standard deep operations group that had existed in various forms and under various names for over 70 years. It had been built for use in human conflict scenarios. The current application was, in the clearest possible sense, a secondary use. He paused for a moment and let the council sit with that. Then he told them about Laura Voss. He said that 4 years ago, a human analyst had gone through every campaign record the Vreth Dominion had produced and found a consistent pattern. The Dominion had never once fought an enemy that refused to be visible. Every civilization that had resisted them had done so in ways the Vreth could see, could plan against, could respond to. Laura had correctly identified that as the one situation the Dominion had no training or institutional memory for. The entire human strategy had grown from that observation. Owen said all of this in a flat, even tone, the same way a person explains something they have thought about so many times that it no longer carries any emotional weight. Then he said one final thing. He said that 55 Vreth military personnel, 47 from the Rethkai fleet, 8 from the reconnaissance wave, were alive and in human custody. They had been treated well. They had access to food, medical care, and regular contact with each other. None of them had been harmed in ways beyond what the engagement itself had produced. He said all 55 would be returned. The condition was simple. The Dominion would establish a new border, withdraw from human space, and not cross that line again. The council chamber on the Vreth side was very still. 14 decorated officers and officials, each one representing centuries of institutional power, sat and looked at a man in a thermal shirt who had just finished explaining, without any particular pride or drama, exactly what had been done to their finest military force, and exactly why it had worked. Zareth Vaughn looked at Owen Garrett for a long time. He was looking for something, some trace of what kind of being he was dealing with. He had read species accurately his entire career. He had almost always known, within the first minutes of contact, what he was facing. He was good at it. It was one of the things he was most certain about in himself. He did not know what he was facing now. He said yes. He said it without consulting the council behind him. He said it quietly and without ceremony, and the council members did not object, not because they agreed, but because they had all run the same quiet calculation he had, and arrived at the same answer. The screen went dark. Owen Garrett sat still for a moment after the call ended. Then he stood up, picked up the coffee mug, and carried it with him as he walked away from the desk. Paige Holloway fell into step beside him. She asked, after a few seconds, whether he thought the Vreth would actually honor the agreement. Owen considered the question. For a while, he said. Long enough. Paige nodded once, slowly, in the way of someone who accepted an answer without being entirely satisfied by it. They walked down a long gray corridor together, without speaking further. At the far end of the corridor was the facility's small kitchen, which had a slightly better coffee machine than the one in the operations room. Back in the operations room, on a side workstation that nobody was currently sitting at, Claire Novak's fold strike arrays rested in standby mode. Every diagnostic line was green. Power draw was minimal. All systems were clean and ready. They sat in the quiet the way things sit when they are built for patience, when they have been used once and set carefully aside, and are simply waiting, without hurry, for the next time the dark outside decides to move. The war chamber of the Vreth Dominion was a cold and enormous room. The walls were made of dark stone that had been carved by machines centuries ago. Tall columns rose from the floor to the ceiling, each one marked with the names of civilizations that the Dominion had conquered. There were 43 names. Each one was carved deep and permanent, the way the Vreth like their victories, final and unquestioned. High Executor Zareth Vaughn stood at the center of the chamber. He was tall, even by Vreth standards, with pale gray skin and 4 arms that moved independently when he was thinking. His council sat around a wide circular table, 14 of them, each one representing a different branch of Vreth military power. Maps and star charts floated above the table, in cold blue light. The subject of tonight's meeting was humanity. Zareth Vaughn had received the first full intelligence report on the human species only 3 days ago. He had read it twice, not because it was complicated, but because it was so unremarkable that he wanted to make sure nothing had been missed. The report described a species that was entirely biological. No cybernetic enhancements, no neural combat links, no externally augmented physical abilities. They were soft creatures that aged and bled and got tired. Their fastest warships required weeks to travel between star systems. Their weapons operated on technologies the Vreth had moved past 400 years ago. "They are not a threat," said the council member on Zareth Vaughn's left, a heavy-set commander named Breth All, who controlled the Dominion's eastern fleets. "They are an inconvenience. They are sitting on 6 star systems that we need access to for the Karath expansion route." "Then we will remove them," Zareth Vaughn said. His voice was low and flat. He did not enjoy unnecessary conversation. The council agreed without debate. The question was, which unit to send? 3 commanders offered their fleets immediately. Zareth Vaughn selected the Rethkai, the Dominion's oldest and most decorated battle force. In 200 years of continuous operation, the Rethkai had never failed a campaign. They had broken civilizations that had seemed unbreakable. They had defeated species with technology far beyond what humanity currently possessed. Sending them against the humans was, by every honest measure, more than enough. It was, some council members quietly thought, almost wasteful. On the other side of the galaxy, in a small monitoring station orbiting the dark side of Neptune's largest moon, a man named Owen Garrett was eating a cold sandwich and staring at a screen. Owen was 61 years old. He had gray hair that he cut himself, and a face that looked like it had spent too many years in low-gravity environments. He had served in the Earth Defense Fleet for 34 years, retired, and then been quietly brought back 7 years ago for reasons that were never formally explained in any document that anyone could find. The screen in front of him was showing a pattern in deep space signal traffic. Gravitational disturbances mostly, the kind that large objects made when they moved in large numbers. The pattern was faint. Most people looking at it would have seen nothing but noise. Owen had spent his career learning to read noise. He finished the sandwich, wiped his hands on the side of his pants, and picked up a communication device. He did not call the government. He did not file an alert with any official office. He scrolled through a list of names that was not stored in any official system and began making calls. The first call went to Derek Cole. Derek was 54, lived in a rented house in rural Colorado, and had spent the last 3 years officially doing nothing. Before that, he had run deep black operations for the Earth Defense Command for 20 years. He had the kind of career that was never discussed at public events, and never appeared in any accessible database. When Owen called, Derek picked up on the second ring. Owen said, "Something is moving." Derek said, "How many?" Owen said, "A lot." There was a short silence. Then Derek said, "I'll start making calls." The second call went to Claire Novak. Claire was 37 and worked alone at a classified research station on the far side of Jupiter. She had been there for 3 years, working on a propulsion and weapons system that did not officially exist. The station had a crew of 11 people, all of them engineers and physicists, who had signed documents they could never discuss with anyone outside the program. Claire was the lead. She slept 4 hours a night, drank too much coffee, and had not taken a single day off in 14 months. When Owen called, she was in the middle of running her 9th consecutive diagnostic on a fold strike drive array. She had built the fold strike system from a theoretical framework that had existed in classified military research for decades. In simple terms, it did not move a ship from one place to another. It placed the ship somewhere else, instantly, without any signal that any known sensor array could detect. Owen told her she had 2 weeks to finish. Claire said, "I need 3. Owen said, 2. Claire looked at the diagnostic screen, looked at the coffee cup on her desk, looked back at the screen. "Fine," she said quietly. 2. The third call Owen made was to a woman named Paige Holloway, who ran operations on a border world called Heron Station. Paige was 42, efficient, and had the rare ability to move large numbers of people without anyone asking too many questions. Owen told her, without full explanation, to begin preparing the 3 border colony worlds for a quiet evacuation. No official emergency protocols, no alarms, no public announcements, no government paperwork. Paige asked how long she had. Owen said, "As long as it takes you." Paige took a steady breath and started making her own calls. Back in the Vreth war chamber, Zareth Vaughn watched the Rethkai fleet depart from a high observation window. 47 warships, each one larger than anything humanity had yet built, moved in tight formation toward human space. Their engines burned cold blue in the dark. It was, by any measure, an overwhelming force. The kind of force that ended arguments before they started. Zareth Vaughn watched until the fleet disappeared from view, then turned and walked back to his desk. There was paperwork to complete, plans to finalize for the expansion ahead. The human matter would be resolved in a matter of weeks, and then there were 30 more systems to think about. He did not think about humanity again that night. In the monitoring station near Neptune, Owen Garrett turned off his display, stood up, and stretched his back. He had one more call to make. He made it standing, looking out a small round window at a field of distant stars. The call connected after 2 rings. He said a name, gave a set of coordinates, said the words Site Keller, and hung up. He stood at the window for another minute without moving. Then he went to find something else to eat. Outside the station, in the cold and the silence, the stars held still and gave nothing away. And somewhere far beyond them, 47 warships were moving toward a quiet they did not yet know how to read.